Gale force winds pinning his competition to the dock. Captain Jake Anderson readies to be the first to throw lines and start the hunt for his $2 million king crab.
In October 2022, Alaska did something it had never done in the history of commercial fishing. It canceled an entire snow crab season because roughly 10 billion crabs had simply vanished from the Bering Sea, not been caught, not relocated, vanished in the space of about 3 years, from a population that scientists had only recently recorded as the largest ever measured. For the men of Deadliest Catch, the Discovery Channel series that had spent nearly 2 decades turning Bering Sea crab fishing into appointment television, this wasn't a plot twist. It was an extinction-level event happening to their entire way of life, in real time, on camera. This is the true story of what actually caused that collapse, how the captains of the show were forced to reinvent themselves almost overnight, and what happened to people who built one of reality television's most enduring franchises. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to go back to 2018, when a federal survey of the eastern Bering Sea recorded roughly 11 billion snow crabs, the highest number ever documented since scientists began tracking the population in the 1970s. It was, by every measure, a healthy and thriving fishery, one that generated well over $100 million a year for Alaska's coastal communities. 3 years later, in 2021, researchers went back out with the same equipment, the same methods, the same stretch of ocean, and found almost nothing. More than 10 billion crabs, upwards of 90% of the entire population, were gone. Fishery scientists had seen population declines before. They had never seen anything remotely like this. For a while, nobody could say with certainty what happened. And in that uncertainty, plenty of theories took hold, including the assumption that overfishing was primarily to blame. It's an understandable guess, since overfishing has driven real declines in other species around the world. But when researchers with NOAA Fisheries and outside scientists actually dug into the data, that explanation didn't hold up. Trawl bycatch, the accidental catching of crabs by boats fishing for other species, had stayed roughly consistent for 2 decades and was far too small to account for a die-off of this size. What the evidence pointed to instead was something scientists call a marine heat wave, an extended stretch of the ocean running dramatically warmer than normal, which struck the Bering Sea in 2018 and 2019. Snow crabs are built for cold water. When their environment warms, their metabolism speeds up, meaning they need significantly more food just to survive. At the same time, the warmer conditions push the crabs into a smaller and smaller pocket of remaining cold water, cramming a shrinking population into a shrinking habitat with shrinking food supply. A team of NOAA scientists, publishing their findings in the journal Science in 2023, concluded that the crabs most likely starved to death, a mass mortality event driven by climate, not by fishing boats. It remains one of the largest documented die-offs of marine animal life ever linked to ocean warming. For the state of Alaska, the math eventually became unavoidable. By the fall of 2022, wildlife managers determined that the surviving snow crab population had fallen so far below the legal threshold required to sustain a season that there was no responsible way to let boats go out. On October 6, 2022, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, working alongside federal regulators, announced that both the snow crab season and the Bristol Bay red king crab season will be canceled entirely for the 2022 to 2023 winter, the first time in the fishery's history that both seasons had been shut down at once. For an industry built around exactly 2 species, and for a television show literally named after the danger catching them, the announcement landed like a gut punch. The captains who had spent years building their entire businesses and their television identities around red king crab and snow crab now had to figure out, almost overnight, how to keep their boats running and their crews paid. Sig Hansen, the veteran captain of the Northwestern and arguably the most recognizable face on the show, took one of the boldest approaches available to him. He moved operations across the Atlantic to fish for red king crab in Norwegian waters, where the population hadn't collapsed the way it had in Alaska. It meant learning new regulations, competing against established local fishing companies, and hauling a Bering Sea boat into an entirely different ocean. All while a camera crew documented the transition for American television audiences who had never seen anything like it on the show before. Other captains adapted closer to home. Josh Harris, who by then was captaining the Cornelia Marie, the boat his late father had made famous, shifted his focus toward golden king crab, a species that hadn't collapsed and remained legal to fish. Golden king crab doesn't carry the same reputation or price tag as red king crab, but it kept boats working and crews employed while the more iconic fisheries sat closed. Across the fleet, captains leaned on golden king crab, Bering crab, and Pacific cod to fill the gap, species that required different gear, different techniques, and in some cases, entirely different fishing grounds than the crews had spent their careers mastering. Discovery Channel chose to keep the show going through this transition rather than cancel it, and the resulting season became less a straightforward crab fishing show and more a documentary about an entire industry scrambling to survive a crisis nobody had planned for. The hope for a one-year recovery didn't happen. In 2023, Alaska canceled the snow crab season again, a second consecutive shutdown that alarmed scientists as much as it devastated the fleet, since a healthy population should have shown at least some sign of rebuilding after a full year without fishing pressure. There was, however, a genuine bright spot buried in the bad news. That same October, Bristol Bay's red king crab fishery, the other half of the original 2022 shutdown, was allowed to reopen after surveys showed the population had climbed back above the harvest threshold. It wasn't the wholesale recovery the industry needed, but it was proof that at least one piece of the puzzle could bounce back under the right conditions. Later research from NOAA, building on the original heatwave findings, found encouraging signs that the surviving snow crab population's energy reserves rebounded fairly quickly once ocean temperatures cooled, with stronger recruitment of young crabs showing up in surveys between 2021 and 2024. Scientists have been careful to note that this recovery remains fragile and that the same population would likely be vulnerable to collapsing all over again if another marine heat wave hits the Bering Sea, a real possibility as ocean temperatures continue trending warmer over the long term. The environmental crisis wasn't the only serious threat Deadliest Catch ever faced behind the scenes, though the other major crisis in the show's history happened over a decade earlier and had nothing to do with crab populations at all. In September 2010, Discovery Channel filed a $3 million breach of contract lawsuit against brothers Jonathan and Andy Hillstrand, the captains of the Time Bandit, claiming they had failed to complete filming obligations for a planned spin-off special called Hillstranded. According to the network's complaint, the brothers had finished the on-location shooting, but then stopped responding to producers when it came time to record voiceover and interview segments needed to finish the special. In protest, the Hillstrand brothers announced they were quitting Deadliest Catch altogether, and fellow Captain Sig Hansen, who wasn't even named in the lawsuit, walked away from the show alongside them in a show of solidarity, a move that stunned fans of the series. The standoff didn't last. Within about a month, Discovery and the Hillstrands reached a settlement. The spin-off special eventually aired the following year under a different title, and all three captains returned to the fleet for the next season. It was a real crisis, but a resolvable one. A reminder that even one of television's toughest, most physically dangerous shows still ran on ordinary contracts and ordinary business disputes behind the scenes. Running alongside every business dispute and environmental disaster in the show's history has been something much more personal. The toll the job and life itself has taken on the people who make it. No loss hit Deadliest Catch harder than the death of Captain Phil Harris, the gravel-voiced, cigarette-smoking captain of the Cornelia Marie, who become one of the show's most beloved figures since its second season. On January 29, 2010, Harris suffered a massive stroke while his crew was offloading crab at a remote port on St. Paul Island in the Pribilof Islands. He was flown to a hospital in Anchorage for surgery and placed in an induced coma to relieve pressure on his brain. For a short time, there were hopeful signs of recovery. He did not survive, and on February 9, 2010, Phil Harris died at the age of 53. His sons, Josh and Jake, who had both worked as deckhands under their father, released a statement saying he had always been a fighter and remained one until the end. Discovery aired his final days and his death as part of the show itself, turning what had been lighthearted reality television into a genuine document of grief. Years later, Josh Harris stepped into his father's role as captain of the Cornelia Marie, carrying both the weight of his father's legacy and, eventually, the added burden of steering the boat to the crab collapse using a species his father had never had to rely on. Health struggles have continued to shape the show in the years since. Captain Wild Bill Wachowski, the blunt, no-nonsense skipper of the Summer Bay and one of the most recognizable personalities on Deadliest Catch, revealed during a season 19 broadcast that he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer and would be undergoing aggressive treatment. Rather than stepping away entirely, Wachowski chose to let cameras document parts of his treatment, saying publicly that he hoped sharing his diagnosis might encourage other men to get screened. By early 2025, he reported on social media that his numbers looked good and that he appeared to be cancer-free, crediting a combination of radiation and hormone therapy. In January 2026, he posted that he had decided to retire from fishing and was planning to try his hand at flipping houses instead. Longtime fans weren't entirely convinced it would stick, and they turned out to be right. By that spring, Wachowski was back on the water for season 22, joking with followers online that the ocean can call you back. As of the season's premiere in May 2026, Discovery had made no announcement of any permanent departure, and Wachowski remained an active part of the fleet. Not every departure from the show has been driven by health or business disputes, and not every story involving the cast has been one of resilience. In 2018, Edgar Hansen, the longtime deck boss of the Northwestern and younger brother of Captain Sig Hansen, pleaded guilty in a Washington state court to fourth-degree assault with sexual motivation, admitting to inappropriately touching a 16-year-old girl at home near Seattle the previous year. He received a suspended jail sentence, was ordered to undergo a sexual deviancy evaluation, and largely disappeared from the public eye in the years that followed. It stands as one of the more sobering footnotes in the show's history, a reminder that the personal lives of reality television's biggest stars don't always mirror the rugged, heroic image built for the cameras. Other cast members simply moved on to different chapters entirely. Scott Campbell Jr., who appeared on the show for years, stepped away after season 17 following a serious back injury, and rather than trying to return to fishing, redirected his energy into building businesses on land, including a cooler company and a firewood supply company. Andy Hillstrand, half of the brother duo behind the Time Bandit, eventually left the series for good after season 19 amid a separate legal dispute, this one involving a crew member injured by fireworks aboard the boat, and has since kept a deliberately low profile away from television entirely. Sean Dwyer, part of a younger generation of captains who came up through the show, hasn't appeared on Deadliest Catch since 2022, but has continued working as a commercial crab fisherman, largely out of the spotlight. Today, more than 2 decades after Deadliest Catch first put Bering Sea crab fishing on American television screens, the fleet looks noticeably different than it did in the show's early seasons, and so does the ocean beneath it. Captains like Sig Hansen and Josh Harris are still out there, but they're fishing for species and in waters that would have seemed unthinkable to feature on the show 15 years ago. The series itself has quietly transformed from a show about a predictable, dangerous, and lucrative annual harvest into something closer to a real-time record of an industry adapting to a changing ocean, one season at a time. Whether the snow crab population fully recovers, or whether future marine heat waves push it back toward collapse, remains an open question that scientists are still actively studying. What isn't in question is that the disappearance of 10 billion crabs from the Bering Sea turned out to be one of the largest, best documented climate disasters most Americans watch unfold from their living rooms, narrated not by a scientist, but by a television show that had spent years telling them the ocean, not the water temperature, was the real danger.